In the 1970s, my husband stood for a kind of provincial position and lost. But in 1981, he stood for Parliament in Durban Central. And he won that seat. So he represented the Progressive Party until 1994. But I just want to add, while we're thinking what happened in those years, I went and worked at Unilever. Firstly, I worked at the Natal University as a kind of secretary to the Senate and Council. And there were lots of events that were happening at that time as well. Firstly, there were forced removals of Indians from an area called Cato Manor, which was just behind the university. And the university bought that land that was owned by Indians who were forcibly removed, and they bought it for a song. And I sat in that, in those council meetings where these purchases were approved, and remembered thinking, you're buying land, you're benefiting from these forced removals. You're just sitting there thinking this. Then Rick Turner was banned, and the council had to debate, do we still pay him his salary or not? It's beyond his control that he can't come and lecture. And then we had Steve Biko on the medical campus, and there were quite a lot of demonstrations and things, and there were quite a lot of medical students who were charged with misdemeanors, I suppose, on campus. And I was the secretary to the council and the Senate, but I also did a lot of other minute taking, and some of that was in the disciplinary hearings. And so again, listening to their experiences, it just all comes together. And I left the university and I went and worked at Unilever in the human resource department. And that was a time when the trade unions were starting to emerge. And Unilever was trying to deal, the HR department was trying to deal with the emergence of trade unions, and how from a company's point of view, did that work? Everyone was finding their way then. I started writing a book called Who's Who in South African Politics, and eventually produced 5 editions. In a way, doing what you're doing, except it was in writing, interviewing people from across the political spectrum, because very few people in South Africa, black and white, really knew who the black leadership was. So I had to do a lot of homework to say, who is the black leadership out there? How do I find them? And interview them so that their stories are told as well. And that book came out, the first edition came out, I think I started work on it in 1983. That was the time the UDF was formed. And it was eventually published in 1985, that first edition. And there were 4 more editions that continued to 1995, and then I stopped. So what those books did was to open up information about the scope of organizations involved in politics and who the leaders were. And it was a very strange time, because I remember going to the newspaper library and asking for their file on Thabo Mbeki, and they didn't have one. There's no information. And so when I started seeking information on various people, it was a complete blank anywhere, which meant I actually had to meet them. And that was another kind of journey, because, because I knew people in the ANC, doors did open. And eventually, I think in 1985, I went to Lusaka and interviewed people directly there. I interviewed people in hiding in South Africa, interviewed people from a ZAPO, from, you know, homeland leaders. It was right across the spectrum. And it started giving me an even broader view of how politics was working. And I think those books played a significant role in retrospect in opening up an understanding of the stories behind leaders in the country, what they looked like. I mean, when I produced that first book, I could not publish a picture of Nelson Mandela. I couldn't publish people. They had a system. If you were listed, your photo couldn't be published, and nor could your opinion. So I couldn't quote you. I couldn't say, you know, Joe Soap said this and this. I had to put it in strange tenses so people could understand how it worked. And when we published that first edition, where the photo should be, it just says photo prohibited by South African law. And one of the things that emerged, it's quite an interesting story. My parents were still living in Zimbabwe, and I went to visit them. And they met with a journalist called Howard Barrell, who reported a lot on the ANC. A lot of his stuff went into the Mail and Guardian. And we met Howard, and we mooted the idea, this was 1985, about getting what was then, I think it was called the Progressive Federal Party, but the leaders were Van Zyl Slabbert and Alec Bahrain and them, getting them to meet the ANC. And we had a whole system, because in those days you couldn't email or call. So we had to have kind of codes of getting this thing approved. So Howard spoke to people in the ANC, and the deal was he would send a telegram, because that's how it worked, where he would say, the idea of launching my book, The Who's Who in South African Politics, was there was great interest in it in Zimbabwe. And that was his code for saying the ANC is interested. And as a result of that, my husband went up to Zimbabwe. He met Thabo Mbeki and Chris Hani, and they organized how this meeting would work, what the agenda would be. Peter couldn't come back and phone Van Zyl Slabbert and say, do you want to meet the ANC? Because somebody's listening on your phone. So he had to fly to Cape Town and say to Slabbert, do you want to meet the ANC? He said yes. So then the thing continued rolling. And that first meeting between Van Zyl Slabbert and the ANC happened in 1985. And what was so interesting for me is how everybody, the press and everyone, assumed it had been organized by Anglo-American. It was just an assumption, when they had nothing to do with it. And even worse, when they heard it had happened, were absolutely furious that they hadn't been part of it. So, you know, those are the kind of shifts that we started to make. And in fact, what that led to was Slabbert leaving Parliament, setting up IDASA, which I don't know if you know what IDASA is. It was the Institute for a Democratic Alternative for South Africa. They organized that huge meeting in Dakar, Senegal, where they took Afrikaners to meet the ANC. That shifted a whole lot of paradigms. So it led on to CODESA. So sometimes you do something small and it has bigger and bigger ramifications later. My first interview was with Victoria Mxenge, who Peter had got to know because he was at the bar, and he knew the lawyers, and she agreed to be my first subject. And when I look back, she must have thought, oh, this writer is a complete idiot. Listen to the questions she's asking. But I improved over time as I got to understand more and more. And so through the stuff I wrote, it short-circuited a whole lot of information that was almost forbidden in the country. So I just, I mean, Victoria was assassinated not long after I wrote about her. So yeah, I think it just opened up a whole space, I suppose, for people to see that there's no enemies in the country. Everybody has a story. Everyone is well intentioned. And I know after I came back from Lusaka, I actually had, I wouldn't say a major breakdown, but I was very emotional because you meet people who've been in exile and you're comfortable with them. They're like me. They talk to me when I got to Lusaka. I mean, there was a whole, you couldn't just travel around on your South African passport in those days. So the ANC had to meet me at the airport. So when I got off the plane, I didn't have a visa. I was put in a little room and I had to wait and hope somebody from the ANC office would pick me up, which they did. And I was there for 3 days. So they put me in Thabo Mbeki's office. And so I was sitting in these little back rooms that the ANC had in Lusaka. And they brought people for me to interview. I interviewed Ray Simons, Chris Hani, Joe Modisa. It was the first interview ever done with a South African journalist. I wasn't really a journalist. Alfred Nazor was there. And I met Oliver Tambo, and they were just so easy and so relaxed. And that when I came back, it was like, what the hell is going on when people can't just talk to people and find a way? Because there were really technically no enemies here. Yeah, it was quite a big shift in my head. There was always people who impressed me enormously with the way they viewed things. Especially I think for those people who saw South Africa in, for me, a very idealistic way of being non-racial, that we are all in this together. And I wouldn't like to sort of pull out one or another. But many people who I interviewed, I really landed up feeling, wow, they did that, they got through this. They're not bitter and nasty about stuff. They've got a vision. They have a view where to go. And I think one of the most devastating things for me subsequently was seeing how people who were so idealistic lost it later. Yeah. And I think living in the 80s in KZN in the early 90s, the amount of death was just astronomical. People totally have no idea how many people died there. And I'm not talking about my husband, the stuff he witnessed. I often ask myself, how do you stay sane? The kind of things that people used to phone him when they were too scared to go home and would ask him to accompany them. And, he'd go to the house and there would be people who'd been shot and totally assassinated. And he would come home and say, there was blood and brains on the wall. And I kept thinking, how do you get through the night with that? So I just think there are lots and lots of these untold stories about how it was in the 80s. And that people came together and found a way out of the whole logjam is still a miracle to me.